Hi, welcome back. So last time I spoke a little bit about the whipping scene in Frogs and the kind of humour we see in Dionysus and Xanthias as a double act. And it's all really been building up to Dionysus's judgment of Aeschylus and Euripides. So we've said throughout the series that the purpose of Dionysus's journey to the underworld in Frogs is to choose the best tragedian to lead Athens out of the kind of pitiable state it's been left in after the Peloponnesian War. So Dionysus has been shown to be an idiot. He can't row a boat, he can't disguise himself effectively, he can't outsmart his own slave, and yet Athens is left in his hands and we're trusting him to judge the best tragedian of the two. And Aristophanes really kind of makes a point of this and underscores this by having the whole argument between Aeschylus and Euripides prefaced by the meeting of two slaves. I said in the last video that actually Xanthias quite often outsmarts Dionysus, and that's the basis of quite a lot of the comedy between the two. There's a very kind of live wire double act. And here we see, after the whipping scene, Xanthias comes out of the skene, he's speaking to another slave who is a slave of the household in the underworld, and they're kind of bonding really over what it means to be a slave and what their experience as a slave is like. We can only really guess how important this would be following the citizenship awarded to slaves after the Battle of Arginusae. If the slaves fought in the Battle of Arginusae, remember, they could achieve citizen status. I should add that in most Aristophanic comedies, slaves feature as a source of humour. It's not particular to Frogs, but it's a very interesting time for Athenians, slaves or former slaves, where people are perhaps rethinking what the experience of a slave was like now that some slaves are coming forward into society as citizens, and after slaves have made, to be honest, a really big contribution to Athenian life. So Xanthias and the slave meet together in front of the skene building and they talk about their masters and they bond over how much they hate them and how much they love the needle of being a slave and getting one up on your master. So they're pretended to be quite devious. They bond over cursing their masters, they bond over spreading rumours about their masters and getting one up on them. And it kind of makes me think actually of maybe Baldric in Blackadder, where you have this, a servant or a slave figure who is often funnier than the master and actually serves as a kind of point of contrast really. If you've ever seen Blackadder, you'll know that Baldric is a really good foil for Blackadder. So there are seasons in which, the character of Blackadder is often a lord and he's really kind of dry and quite vulpine, and then Baldric's quite silly but undercuts a lot of Blackadder's plans. So that you could imagine it that way if you're trying to think of a modernish parallel. And they really get together to talk about what's going to happen next. So when Xanthias says, "What's all that noise coming from inside the house?" which is a great built-in stage direction for us, it gives us an insight into the kind of background noise and sets the scene. The slave says, "Oh, that's Aeschylus and Euripides fighting." That's always the case, they're always at each other's throats. So we have two tragedians who are big writers of domestic tragedy, of households being torn apart in their own kind of tragic domos, in their own tragic household, which is really quite funny to begin with. So we have this expectation that the Argo scene between these two tragedians isn't going to be civilised. We have these really highfalutin tragedians who you think are going to be above board and are going to be decent about it, and to be honest, they're just not.
Well, if you must fight...
We must! The fiend is at mine elbow and tempts me.
All right. But no violence. Let your words be your weapons and may the best man win.
So it sets an expectation and it primes us for what's going to come. And it also kind of sets up expectations about who likes Euripides and who likes Aeschylus. So for us, we think of Greek tragedy quite often all as one, all as like a mark of culture. We see it as part of cultural heritage for key figures like Shakespeare. But actually, the perception that Aristophanes puts forward is bad people like Euripides, because Euripides plays are really immoral or really morally difficult, and good people like Aeschylus, because Aeschylus is a traditionalist. So you've got this kind of new wave Euripides versus this old school Aeschylus, and it becomes a bit of a cult of personality. which tragedian you favour says something about who you are as a person. And the slave comments on this when he's talking to Xanthias. He says, you know, Euripides came down here and all the muggers and the pickpockets loved him, all the beggars loved him. So Euripides appeals to the worst class of people, but also the most immoral class of people. He's not just saying that poor people like him or that slaves like him. He's saying people that make poor moral decisions really like Euripides. So it's kind of a statement on who you are. Think about it, I suppose, if you've ever, you know, shied away from telling someone what music you listen to because you think they'll think you're a bit weird, or you don't put your iPod on shuffle. Ancient equivalent of that. If you're seen to be liking Euripides, what does that actually say about you? Aeschylus is the kind of more traditional figure that we see, and there seems to be quite a bit of humour based on who is being re-performed as well. So remember, although Aeschylus hasn't been around for a far longer time, his career was much earlier than Euripides' career. Actually, Aeschylus was re-performed fairly soon after his death and fairly consistently, whereas after Euripides died, it was a little bit later that he started to be re-performed. Aeschylus was canonised and made a kind of traditional playwright far, far earlier. It also sets up the expectation that Sophocles is exempt, because Xanthias can ask the slave for all of the inside scoop on what's going on in the underworld, and he says, well, what about Sophocles? And the slave makes clear that actually Sophocles is exempt, possibly because in real life he'd only very recently passed away, and partly maybe because Sophocles' career overlaps with Euripides'. They're near contemporary. He started earlier but wrote at a similar time, and he occupies more of a middle ground between Euripides and Aeschylus. It's surely funnier to have two extremes clash than it is to kind of clutter and confuse this argument with a third person who's a bit on the fence and a bit in between and bridges the gap between the two. The contrast of opposites is going to be funnier. And this kind of bears fruit really when we see the two tragedians come out. I have absolutely no idea how this would have been achieved in costume at all. I would have probably had Aeschylus look like quite an old, fat, white-haired windbag, and I would have had Euripides look perhaps, you know, if we compare against other depictions of him, quite effeminate. In Aristophanes' comedies elsewhere, Euripides, like Agathon, is quite a fey character. So thinking about someone who's very, you know, like a new age kind of hippie figure would work really well. When they come out, the main basis for the argument is meant to be the quality of their speech, the quality of their drama, but actually what tends to be the case is the morality of each tragedian becomes more important, because actually that's the premise of Dionysus going to the underworld. It's not, you know, who writes the prettiest lines, it's who's going to save Athens. So it's actually more about values perhaps than it is about dramatic skill. And when they argue and they come out, Euripides is very upfront. Euripides comes out absolutely guns blazing, he's here for it, he's all over it. Whereas Aeschylus is really, really quiet, and he's kind of mimicking what would happen in Aeschylus' tragedies. And Euripides really makes a point of this. He says, you know, Aeschylus is doing this for dramatic effect. He thinks if he sits silently, he can build suspense and build a lot of attention for himself, and it's the same crap he pulls in his plays, and it doesn't really work. Aeschylus then, despite being the moral compass of the group and the traditionalist, in his first line has a dig at Euripides' mum. So Aeschylus actually breaks out a yo mama joke, really, and says something about Euripides' mum having been a greengrocer, so like a comment on class, which is funny because it's a dig at Euripides, but it's also funny because Aeschylus is incredibly petty and he's not really the kind of moral arbiter we thought he was going to be. And then really a lot of it is a slam on the kind of tropes and the stereotypes of one another's plays. Euripides is criticised for making lots of rags. So Euripides had a lot of beggars in his plays, he had people, you know, who were particularly destitute, and that's a trope that he used quite a lot. Aeschylus is slammed for having people appear silent at the beginning of his plays. That's something he did with Niobe, one of the plays that we've lost. And Euripides is really criticised for having Cretan women, whores like Phaedra and Sthethembeia. So the kind of immorality of having these women who have, you know, really unconventional desires or unconventional relationships. And in the character Phaedra as well, who you might have come across when looking at Seneca's Phaedra on another module if you're doing the A-level, you know, she falls in love with her stepson in Euripides' Hippolytus. And that play was so problematic that Euripides wrote a version and then had to kind of rewrite a PG version because it was so controversial. So Euripides added, apparently, a whole prologue from Aphrodite, who was going to really impair Phaedra's judgment, because God forbid Phaedra should actually just fancy her stepson off her own merit because they're about the same age. So there's a big moral concern between the two. They're both very petty, and Dionysus is really crap at mediating. If you read this scene, Dionysus jumps in with little comments that actually are sometimes really easily slammed down by the tragedians anyway. When Euripides criticises Aeschylus for having these quiet openings, Dionysus sort of timidly jumps in, oh, I quite liked them, I thought they were alright. And Euripides actually says, yeah, because you were naive and you didn't know what was good, and he gets away with it. So Dionysus isn't the judge that we wanted him to be, or maybe he is, in the case of a comedy, I suppose. He doesn't do a great job at it, and the greatest comedy and the greatest import really comes from the Initiants breaking in every now and then. Dionysus is a crap mediator of the argon between the two tragedians. And so Dionysus flounders for ages, and it gets more and more heated until Aeschylus and Euripides eventually start weighing their lines for the weightier line. So Dionysus is so poorly placed to make a comment on quality that the assessment comes down to the quantity of metre, which is really ridiculous, and it's pushing this kind of theme of absurdity really far. And it's only when Pluto intervenes, the king of the underworld, and says, look, you've got to make a choice, that Dionysus actually gets anywhere. And even when Dionysus finally does choose Aeschylus, Euripides has no problem taking him to task on it and saying, how dare you say that to me right to my face. So Dionysus makes a judgment that seems to be really based on the tragedians' morality. He has a go at weighing their lines, he's inept at judging the quality of their lines and the tropes that they show in their tragedies, he's inept at mediating the argument between the two, and when it really comes down to it, after all that faffing about, Dionysus just asks a couple of questions on key events and says, what do you think about this? And then picks the person with the most fashionable moral answer. So Aeschylus is ultimately the one who is raised up from the underworld, and as he comes up, he offers his seat to Sophocles, giving the impression that Euripides can never really be the number one tragedian. That's not to say Euripides wasn't reperformed, he was, but far later. It's just to say that this is picked on a moral basis, leaving a kind of unsatisfying ending. You know, we probably should have Aeschylus because he's the most moral, not because he's the best, not because Dionysus did a good job of judging it, and that's where most of the humour of Frogs really falls. We're relying on Dionysus to save Athens, and we're reminded at every possible opportunity in the play he's not a great person for the job. But therein again, isn't that the point of a comedy? To make something as absurd and as funny as it possibly could be. So I hope this series on Aristophanes' Frogs has been really helpful for you, whether you've been reading for interest, studying it for the A-level, or looking at it for university. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to keep the channel going, and do take a look at the website I've put together with all my projects and artwork and everything that I'm working on at the moment. I've certainly got lots of collections on classics on Redbubble if you're looking to get something new. Alright, thanks. I'll see you soon.